But if you can persuade yourself that the variance within each of these groups is dictated by gender, the women, of course, get the short end of the stick, age, life cycle patterns, and luck. If all of the distribution is attributable to those forces, who cares? Because significant differences between societies are not going to be explained by differences in their life cycle patterns or differences in their gender mix, pretty much 50-50 everywhere, etc. And luck is random. So you'll be picking up the systematic forces that are driving inequality if you have good evidence on average incomes in each of these groups. And here you have it around about the French Revolution, where scholars of that time were able to supply estimates of per capita income within these groups, the share of the population in each of these groups, and the share of the household heads, not shown, in each of these groups. This is the form a social table would take in making this construction. Some of the observations we're going to look at have a very large number of social classes, and like Brazil, for example, in the 1870-something or other, and some have less, like this one, and some will have only 3. And so you're going to want to ask, Ben is going to want to ask, does that present a systematic bias? The size of the number of classes that you have measuring the inequality for each of these groups. Okay, so that's the kind of information we've got. And here's how it looks going from the first observation, the Roman Empire in the year 14, and going upwards through time. You can see the column tells you it's not all social tables. Some of it is coming from tax data. Some of it is actually in Old Castile. They actually, in the mid-18th century, the king said, I want to take a social survey. I want to know income and wealth conditions all over Castile, I guess it was. And a lot of it hasn't survived, but some of it has, and that's what's there, etc. So the kind of data that's being used to generate measures of inequality might vary from place to place. And when we start doing some simple empirics, we want to see whether that matters or whether it's just random. It doesn't matter how the data is being collected. It doesn't matter how many groups you include in constructing these estimates, but it's other more fundamental things that matter. Here are some other examples that bring you up close. Our last observation is British India, just prior to the partitions and the disappearance of the British. So that's our last observation. Okay, so let me just lay out on the table some key facts that are going to be central to describing the distribution of income for pre-industrial societies, which, after all, in which human capital is not very important, physical capital is not very important. It's all about land and labor. It's about who owns the land and what the rents are in that land and what the wages are for raw labor. That's going to be a central part of any story. And Ricardian models and all the classical models take that attribute, including Marx, in describing pre-industrial systems. And so won't I in doing this. So what are the constraints? First fact, the average income, these are poor societies, of course. So GDP per capita is really low in these pre-industrial societies. And as you can see from what it says here, on average, the GDP per capita is maybe twice, sometimes as many as 5 times, but that's rare, and never more than that, above the subsistence level. So there's not much economic room between the average per capita income and subsistence, just sufficient to survive in these poor societies. So that's the first fact. Second fact, in order for a system to survive and persist through time, any social system, you can't have people falling below the safety net. You can't have them falling below the poverty line, or they'll die, and the system will falter and fail. And the elite will not find labor to perform everything they need to perform out there in the hectares. Okay, so this means that the elite surplus, no matter how greedy, the surplus of the elite is really restricted in these poor societies. They may be greedy, but if they want the system to persist, they cannot push people below subsistence. And the average income in these poor societies is not very far above subsistence. So the amount of surplus available for them to extract from the system is pretty modest. So then the question is, if you start from a very poor society where per capita income is not all that different from subsistence and what's available for the elite to extract for their own greed, satisfy their own greed, what happens as that society slowly begins to undergo economic improvement? I'm not talking double digit, we're talking about very glacially slow change, but positive change. Increase in yields slowly over time, improving per capita income over time. And so the potential surplus will rise. That's available for the elite to extract. How much do they extract? They extract all of it or no. And if they don't extract all of it, why don't they extract all of it? Why do they let some of it trickle down in the story? So we'll be able to deal with these issues with the evidence I'm going to present you. Okay, now about the new measure. And the new measure has to do with what the three of us call the inequality possibility frontier. And the question will be, if the elite had the control and the will, how unequal could they make the society at its maximum? That is, how much surplus can they extract and make the system persist over time? I'm going to go over this bit fast because there's a lot of notation which you probably will be bored with. But to make it simple, just divide society in these two groups. Those that have it and those that don't. And those that have it are the elite, landed elite at the top, very small group, and the rest are landless peasants in the system. Okay, and also assume that the elite at the top share that surplus equally. It's a family enterprise. Idi Amin even has to share it, with his brother. So let's assume that in the story, and assume that these two classes are quite distinct. There is no fuzzy overlap between the two. You're either a member of the elite or you're not, period. End of story. So under these assumptions, and with every peasant getting subsistence, wages, there is no variance within either of these two groups. Everybody gets the same, and so all the inequality is driven by the difference between the two groups. The economic distance between average incomes for the elite and average incomes for those at the bottom. That's where all the inequality would be. So under those assumptions, one measure, the Gini coefficient, would simply look like that. Aren't you interested in that? Isn't that beautiful? Look at that. It's gorgeous. But I'm going to go through this quickly, but there's a bottom line, so I don't want to go through it too quickly. So the Gini on the left is, this measure of inequality, 0 to 1. If you're extremely unequal, you're up towards 1, like China today, or like the U.S., and I don't know where the Philippines is. Or if you're Sweden and very egalitarian, you're down closer to 0. Okay, so that's written as 1 over this mu thing, which is just average per capita income. And that's average income in the society. And those Y's are income for the two groups, J being the elite at the top and I being the poor suckers at the bottom, the landless peasants. And there are the proportions. PJ presumably is a very small number and PI is really big. 95, 98, 99% are landless peasants in this system. Well, you can play with this. You can have an expression for the average income for the high group and plug things in, making these substitutions, and you get this stuff down here. And this stuff down here is 1 minus epsilon. Epsilon is the proportion, the elite's share in the total population, a small number. And it's going to approach 0. If Idi Amin would like to have it approach 0, it's kind of only one guy, a very small share in the total. That's the mean income as we talked about, and that's the economic distance between the mean income and the subsistence income. So the Gini, it was being driven by how large is the elite class, the average income, because that's going to determine whether there's a surplus to be extracted, and this economic distance between the average and the subsistence. Hey, things are pretty straightforward in explaining how inequality moves then in this system. Well, you can play with this thing and strip it down even further if you like. And these alphas is the ratio of the average income relative to subsistence. But the point is, you can reduce in measuring inequality over time. Your expectations would, you haven't looked at any numbers yet, but your expectations would be, gee, everything is going to be driven by just a few parameters in the system. And the first parameter is, how far has this economy moved itself from subsistence, its average income? Some measure of slow development over time. That's the alpha part. And second, how big is the elite group? And that's all there is to it. It's going to be simple in explaining the determinants of inequality, we think, in terms of this theory. But we're not talking about the theory, we're talking about the facts. So yeah, talking about it. Okay, so the maximum inequality is the maximum the elite can extract, but allowing all the poor peasants to get a subsistence income so that they survive over time. Said that. So here's this new measure of inequality under these conditions. And that is, how much does the elite actually extract, given that we know what the maximum is? Are they soft on the non-elite, or are they harsh on the non-elite in extracting? And they can extract this in many ways, I mean, they can set the terms of wage payments. They can manipulate the institutions in their favor. They have all kinds of devices in the form of institutions and politics and all the rest to make things work in their behalf. But they may be wise to not be too extreme, or the system will not survive. Of course, you may have a revolution too that you might worry about if you're too severe. Let's call the ratio of what they actually extract to the maximum inequality, the extraction ratio. I like that term, extraction. They are using, anti-market devices and institutions and so on to try to extract maximum inequality they can, subject to the system surviving.